My controlling wife is forcing our son to quit the one thing he loves because she thinks it will turn him into a sinner. I don't know if our marriage can survive this. My wife and I have been married for 11 years. We met at church, got married at church, and raised our son in the church. Faith has always been important to both of us, but my wife takes it to a level I never agreed to. It started small. When our son was 6, she didn't want him watching cartoons with magic in them because she said it was promoting witchcraft. I thought she was overreacting, but I let it go. When he was 8, she pulled him out of a school play because he was cast as a villain, and she said Christians shouldn't pretend to be evil, even in fiction. I pushed back on that one, but she cried and said I was undermining her values, so I backed down. When he was 10, she found out his best friend's parents were divorced, and she told our son he couldn't go to that kid's house anymore because broken homes were bad influences. That one turned into a fight. I told her she was being judgmental and cruel, and she told me I was putting the world above God. We didn't speak for 3 days. I apologized just to end the silence. Looking back, I should have held my ground. Our son is 12 now, and the only thing he's ever been passionate about is swimming. He's been on a team for 2 years, and his coach says he has real talent. He wakes up early for practice without complaining. He talks about wanting to compete in high school, maybe even get a scholarship one day. It's the first time I've seen him excited about his future. Last month, my wife told me she wanted to pull him from the team. I asked her why, and she said she had been watching the practices and she didn't like what she saw. I asked what that meant. She said the girls on the team wear swimsuits that are too revealing, and she doesn't want our son exposed to that every day. She said it's an environment that normalizes lust and it will corrupt him. I told her that was insane. I told her he's 12 years old and he's focused on swimming, not on what the girls are wearing. She said that's exactly what the devil wants us to think. She said by the time we notice the damage, it will already be done. I told her I wasn't pulling him from the team. She said fine. She would do it herself. The next day, she went to the pool and told his coach that our son was quitting effective immediately. She didn't ask me. She didn't warn me. I found out when my son came home crying and asked me why Mom hated him. I confronted her that night and she was completely calm about it. She said she did what she had to do to protect him. She said I was too weak to make the hard decisions, so she made it for both of us. She said one day he would thank her. I told her she had no right to make that decision alone. She said she had every right because she was his mother, and she could see the danger even if I couldn't. I asked her what danger. A 12-year-old swimming lapse. She said I was being naive and that the world was full of temptation, and it was her job to keep him pure. I asked her if she hurt herself. She told me to stop mocking her faith. I told her this wasn't about faith, it was about control. She didn't speak to me for a week after that. During that week, my son barely came out of his room. He stopped eating dinner with us. When I tried to talk to him, he just said it didn't matter because Mom always wins anyway. That broke something in me. I went back to my wife and told her we needed to re-enroll him. I told her I would handle the registration and drive him myself if she refused to be involved. She looked at me and said if I did that, she would leave and take him with her. She said no judge would side with a father who forced his son into an environment full of half-naked girls. She said she had already talked to her pastor, and he agreed she was doing the right thing. She said her parents would support her too. She told me to think very carefully about the hill I wanted to die on. I didn't know what to say. I still don't. Part of me wants to call her bluff, but part of me knows she's not bluffing. She would leave. She would take him. She would tell everyone I chose swimming over my family, and they would believe her because they go to her church and they think the way she thinks. My son asked me yesterday if there was any chance he could go back to the team. I told him I was working on it. He said okay and went back to his room. I'm running out of time to figure this out. I know my wife believes she's protecting him. I know her faith is real and her fear is real. But I also know my son is slipping away and she can't see it. I don't know if I should fight her on this and risk losing everything or give in and watch my son become someone who stops dreaming because his mother decided his dreams were sinful. I honestly don't know what to do anymore. I spend the morning sitting at my desk pretending to work while my laptop screen shows search results for family law attorneys in our area. My hands shake every time I click on a new article about custody battles. The words blur together after a while, but certain phrases jump out and stick in my mind like thorns. Fathers who lose custody to mothers with strong religious communities. Judges who defer to maternal instinct in cases involving moral disagreements. Courts that view restrictions on activities as protective parenting rather than control. I read one case about a dad who fought his ex-wife over homeschooling and lost because the judge said the mother's religious freedom outweighed his concerns about social isolation. Another article discusses how hard it is to prove emotional harm when there's no physical abuse. My stomach turns as I realize how many ways this could go wrong. I bookmark 3 attorney websites but can't bring myself to call any of them yet. The sound of my wife moving around upstairs makes me close the laptop quickly. I'm not ready to have this conversation. I don't even know what I would say if she asked what I was doing. Dinner that night feels like sitting in a room with strangers. My son pushes food around his plate without eating much of anything. He asks to be excused after 10 minutes, and my wife nods without looking up from her own meal. After he leaves the table, she comments that he seems calmer lately. She says removing the swimming distraction has given him more peace. I bite down on the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood because I want to scream at her that our son is dying inside, but starting that fight right now would be stupid. I need a plan first. I need to know what I'm doing before I make any moves. After dinner, I clean up the kitchen while my wife goes upstairs to read. I sit in the dark living room after she goes to bed and stare at my phone for hours, trying to figure out who I can talk to about this. Most of our friends go to her church. Her family will take her side no matter what. My own parents live 3 states away and barely understand why this is even a problem. I think about calling my brother, but he's never had kids and wouldn't get it. Around 2 in the morning, I remember Jason from college. Jason and I were roommates junior year before he transferred to finish his degree closer to home. We stayed in touch for a few years after graduation, but lost contact when life got busy. I know from mutual friends that he became some kind of therapist and still lives in the area. I pull up Facebook and find his profile. His page says he's a family therapist with a practice about 30 minutes from here. I stare at his contact info for another hour before I finally send him a message. I keep it short and vague. I say I'm dealing with some family stuff and could use advice from someone who understands these situations. I ask if he has time to meet for coffee. I don't mention my wife or the swimming or any of the actual problems because I'm paranoid about leaving a trail she might find. I expect it will take him days to respond if he responds at all. He messages back within an hour saying he has time this afternoon and suggests a coffee shop across town where nobody from my wife's church would ever go. Meeting Jason feels like coming up for air after being underwater too long. He looks older but the same, and he gives me a hug before we even sit down. I start talking and can't stop. I tell him about the swimming team and my wife pulling our son out without asking me. I explain about the restrictions over the years and how they keep getting worse. I describe my son's withdrawal and the way he stopped trying to argue or even hope for anything. Jason listens without interrupting and asks questions that make me see things I've been trying not to see. He asks how my son's grades are doing, and I realize they've dropped. He asks if my son has friends outside of church, and I have to admit most of those friendships ended when my wife decided they were bad influences. He asks if my son talks about the future anymore, and I remember that he used to talk about college and swimming scholarships, and now he doesn't mention anything past next week. When I tell Jason about my wife's threat to leave and take our son with her, his whole face changes. He leans forward and his voice gets serious. He says I need to start writing everything down. He says I should document every restriction and every conversation and every change in my son's behavior. He tells me I need to talk to a family law attorney soon, even if I'm not ready to file anything yet. He says I need to understand my rights and my options before this gets worse. Jason pulls out his phone and shows me his wife's contact information. Her name is Michaela, and she's a child psychologist who works with kids from strict religious families. He says she specializes in helping children who've experienced religious trauma. The word trauma hits me hard. I've been telling myself this whole time that my wife is just being overprotective, that she's strict but not harmful, that our son will be fine once he gets older and has more independence. Hearing Jason use the word trauma makes it real in a way I wasn't ready for. I ask him if he really thinks my son is being traumatized, and Jason looks at me with something that might be pity. He says that isolation from normal activities and friendships, progressive restrictions on autonomy, and the level of control my wife exercises over every aspect of our son's life are all warning signs. He says the fact that my son has stopped hoping for anything and believes nothing he wants matters is a serious red flag. I agree to meet with Michaela next week, even though I feel guilty about going behind my wife's back. I tell myself I'm just gathering information. I tell myself I'm being smart and careful. I tell myself this isn't betrayal. Jason pays for the coffee and walks me to my car and tells me I'm doing the right thing by taking this seriously. I want to believe him. That weekend, my son finds me in the garage and asks if there's any chance he can go back to swimming. I tell him I'm working on it and try to sound more sure than I feel. He looks at me with so much hope in his eyes that I almost break down right there in front of him. I want to promise him everything will be okay, but I can't lie to him anymore. My wife comes outside and hears the end of our conversation. After my son goes back inside, she tells me I need to stop giving him false hope. She says I'm making this harder by not accepting her decision. She says the sooner he moves on from swimming, the sooner he can focus on things that actually matter. I realize as she's talking that she genuinely believes she's being kind. She thinks crushing his dreams quickly is better than letting him hope for something she'll never allow. She thinks she's protecting him from disappointment, when really she's teaching him that nothing he wants will ever matter. I don't say any of this out loud because I'm still not ready for the fight that would follow. I just nod and go back inside and hate myself a little bit more. I meet with Michaela at her office on Tuesday afternoon. The space is comfortable and quiet with toys in one corner and art supplies on a side table. She offers me tea and we sit in chairs that face each other instead of across a desk. She asks me to describe my son's behavior over the past 6 years, starting from when the restrictions began. I talk about the cartoons and the school play and the friend whose parents were divorced. I explain how each restriction led to another one and how my son stopped arguing after a while. Michaela takes notes and I can see her concern growing as I talk. She asks about his sleep, and I admit he's been having trouble falling asleep lately. She asks about his appetite, and I remember he barely eats dinner anymore. She asks if he's mentioned feeling sad or hopeless, and I think about all the times he said it doesn't matter what he wants. Michaela puts down her pen and looks at me directly. She says what I'm describing shows clear signs of harm from too much control. She says my son's giving up and pulling away are serious problems that shouldn't be ignored. She uses clinical terms that make everything sound worse and also more real. She talks about learned helplessness and emotional suppression and developmental harm. I feel sick listening to her because I've been living with this for years and telling myself it was fine. Michaela asks if my son has any adults in his life that he trusts and can talk to freely. I try to think of someone and realize with horror that my wife has slowly cut off almost every relationship like that. His old coach might have been one, but my wife ended that. Teachers at the school maybe, but my wife monitors his schoolwork closely, and he knows anything he says might get back to her. Friends' parents used to be safe, but most of those friendships are gone now. I tell Michaela all of this and watch her write more notes. She suggests I start rebuilding some of those connections carefully without making it obvious what I'm doing. She says, when I tell her my wife would never agree to secular counseling, Michaela nods like she expected that answer. She says the school counselor can start services if they have concerns about a student's well-being. She says I should reach out to the school and let them know what's going on. She gives me her card and tells me to call anytime. She says my son needs support from multiple adults right now, and I shouldn't try to handle this alone. I go home that night and find my son in his room staring at photos from his swim team. The pictures are spread across his bed, and he's just looking at them with this empty expression that makes my chest hurt. I sit down next to him without asking permission. I tell him honestly that his mom and I don't agree about the swimming situation. I tell him I'm trying to find a solution, but it might take some time. He doesn't look at me when he asks if I'm going to give up like I always do. The question cuts deeper than anything my wife has said, because he's completely right. I have given up every single time before this. I've backed down and apologized and let her win because it was easier than fighting. I've taught my son that I can't be counted on to protect him when it matters. I put my hand on his shoulder and tell him I'm not giving up this time. I tell him I'm talking to people who can help and making a real plan. He finally looks at me, and I can see he wants to believe me, but he's afraid to hope. I don't blame him. I wouldn't believe me either based on my history. I promise him I'm going to fix this, and then I leave his room before I start crying in front of him. The next morning, I call Coach Marguerite before I can talk myself out of it. I explain the situation as simply as I can without bad-mouthing my wife. I tell her my son wants to come back to the team and ask if that would be possible if I can work things out. Coach Marguerite's response is immediate and warm. She says she's had parents pull kids from the team for all kinds of reasons over the years, and my son would be welcomed back any time. She says he's a talented swimmer and the team has missed him. Then she says something that surprises me. She mentions that she's noticed over the years how uncomfortable my wife seemed at practices. She asks if there's anything she can do to help with the situation. I realize other adults have been watching this whole time. They've seen the pattern even if they didn't say anything. I thank her and tell her I'll be in touch soon. After I hang up, I sit in my car feeling like maybe I'm not as alone in this as I thought. Maybe there are people who will support my son if I can just be brave enough to ask for help. Maybe I can actually do this. I call the school the next morning and ask to speak with Marco Lombardi. The secretary puts me through and his voice is warm when he answers. I explain that I'm concerned about my son's behavior lately and would like to meet if he has time. Marco tells me he's actually been meaning to reach out because several teachers have mentioned that my son seems different this past month. He asks if I can come in Thursday afternoon. I agree and hang up feeling like maybe I'm not crazy for being worried, but I also feel scared about what he's going to tell me. That night at dinner, my wife sets down her fork and announces that she's enrolled our son in the church youth group. She says he'll be attending 3 evenings a week starting next Monday. My son's face goes completely blank. I recognize that look now. It's the same one he had when she pulled him from swimming. I ask if we can talk about this privately first. My wife looks at me like I've said something ridiculous. She says there's nothing to discuss because our son has too much free time now and idle hands are the devil's workshop. She says she's being a responsible parent by making sure he's surrounded by good Christian influences. My son stares at his plate and doesn't eat another bite. After he goes to bed, I find my wife in the kitchen and tell her I think our son should have some say in whether he attends youth group. She turns around and her expression is hard, She says children don't get to decide what's best for their spiritual development. She says my willingness to negotiate with him about everything is exactly why he's so resistant to proper authority. I tell her that forcing him into activities he doesn't want is pushing him away from faith entirely. She says I'm undermining her parenting and making it impossible for her to raise him right. I say she's controlling every aspect of his life and suffocating him. The argument gets louder. She accuses me of caring more about his happiness than his soul. I tell her she's using religion as an excuse to keep him isolated. She says I'm too weak to make hard decisions. I say she's too scared to let him be a normal kid. We go back and forth until I'm exhausted and she's crying angry tears. She tells me to sleep somewhere else. I grab a pillow and blanket and go to the couch. In the morning, she acts like nothing happened. She makes breakfast and tells our son cheerfully about all the fun activities the youth group does. He sits there eating his cereal and not responding. When she leaves for her Bible study, he comes into the living room where I'm folding the blanket. He asks me quietly if I'm going to let her do this. I promise him I'm working on a plan. He nods, but I can see in his eyes that he doesn't believe me anymore. I don't blame him. I've let him down every other time. Thursday afternoon, I meet with Marco in his office at the school. He's younger than I expected, with an easy manner that makes me feel less defensive. He starts by telling me that 4 different teachers have mentioned concerns about my son over the past few weeks. They've noticed he's more withdrawn in class. He doesn't participate like he used to. One teacher described his attitude as defeated. Marco asks gently about what's going on at home. I find myself telling him more than I planned. I explain about the swimming team and my wife's reasons for pulling him out. I mention the pattern of restrictions over the years. Marco listens carefully and takes notes. When I finish, he's quiet for a moment. Then he says he respects that families have different values, but he's concerned about my son's emotional well-being. He says the changes the teachers are seeing combined with what I've described suggest my son is struggling. He asks if I would consent to him starting some counseling sessions with my son at the school. I ask what that would involve. Marco explains that he would meet with my son once or twice a week during study hall. They would talk about coping skills and ways to express his feelings. The sessions would be confidential unless my son was in danger. I realize this is exactly what Michaela suggested. I tell Marco yes. He pulls out consent forms and I sign them right there. He assures me he'll focus on giving my son tools to handle stress and won't push any particular agenda. As I leave his office, I feel like I've just crossed a line I can't uncross. I made a major decision about my son without telling my wife. She's going to be furious when she finds out. But for the first time in years, I feel like I'm actually helping my son instead of just trying to keep peace. That evening, Jason calls to check on me. I tell him about the youth group announcement and the school counseling I just authorized. My voice breaks when I'm explaining it, and suddenly I'm crying on the phone. Jason lets me get it out. Then he tells me I'm making the right choices to protect my son. He says I need to prepare for my wife's reaction when she discovers I'm taking action without her approval. He suggests I talk to a family law attorney this week. Not necessarily to file anything, but just to understand my rights and options if this escalates. He gives me a name, Verity Wainwright. He says she's helped several of his clients navigate custody issues. I write down her number. 2 days later, I'm sitting in Verity's office laying out the entire situation. I start from 6 years ago with the cartoon ban and walk through every restriction and conflict up to the swimming crisis and the school counseling I just authorized. Verity listens without interrupting and takes detailed notes. When I finish, she explains that custody decisions focus on the child's best interests. She says a pattern of one parent isolating a child from normal activities and social connections could be concerning to a judge. She asks if I've been documenting everything. I tell her about the notes I've been keeping. She says that's good, and the school counselor's involvement strengthens my position if this goes to court. Then she asks about my wife's support network. I explain about her church community and her pastor who validated her decision about swimming. I mention her parents who share her views and would back her up in any custody fight. Verity nods seriously. She says religious freedom is protected, but not when it causes demonstrable harm to a child. She explains that the key would be showing that my son's emotional health is suffering under these restrictions. She advises me to keep detailed notes of every incident, save all text messages and emails, continue building relationships with professionals like Marco who can speak to my son's well-being. She says if my wife does file for custody, I need to be ready to demonstrate a pattern of harm. I leave her office and sit in my car for 20 minutes. Now I have concrete information about custody law and my rights. This situation feels more real than it did an hour ago. I try to imagine actually going through with a separation, a custody battle, having to explain to a judge why my wife's parenting is harmful. The thought of my son being forced to live full-time under her restrictions if I lose makes me feel sick. But doing nothing means watching him continue to suffer. I start the car and drive home knowing I've already made my choice, even if I'm scared of where it leads. My son walks through the front door that afternoon and drops his backpack by the stairs. I'm sitting at the kitchen table pretending to work on my laptop, but really I'm just refreshing the same email over and over. He sees me and something in his face shifts. Not quite a smile, but not the blank look he's been wearing for weeks either. I ask him how his day was and he shrugs, but then he says, "Marco is pretty cool, actually." My wife looks up from the counter where she's chopping vegetables. She asks what they talked about. My son glances at me for just a second before he says, "Just school stuff, how classes are going, normal things." It's technically true, but I can hear the protection in his voice. He's not lying, but he's not telling her everything either. My wife nods and goes back to the vegetables. My son heads upstairs, and as he passes me, he gives me this look. Like we're on the same team now. Like he knows I'm trying to help him even if he doesn't understand all of it yet. That look stays with me all evening. I keep thinking about how he protected the truth without lying. How he understood without me having to explain that some things need to stay private from his mother right now. 2 weeks pass and I fall into a rhythm of dropping him at the school early on his counseling days. Marco schedules the sessions before first period so my wife doesn't notice the disruption. My son seems lighter somehow, still quiet but not quite so defeated. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rings at work. Marco's name on the screen. I step out of my office and into the stairwell where nobody can hear me. Marco says he needs to see me today if possible. There are some concerns about what my son has been sharing in their sessions. My stomach drops, but I tell him I can be there in 30 minutes. I grab my keys and tell my boss I have a family emergency. The drive to the school feels longer than it should. I park in the visitor lot and walk through the front entrance and sign in at the office. Marco meets me in the hallway and leads me to his office. He closes the door and gestures for me to sit. His face is serious in a way I haven't seen before. He says my son has been opening up more in their recent sessions. "That's good," Marco says, "but some of what he's sharing is concerning." He pulls out his notes and I can see how many pages there are. Marco explains that my son has expressed feelings of hopelessness, that he believes he has no control over his own life, that he mentioned wishing he could just disappear sometimes. Marco's professional calm cracks just slightly when he says these last words. He leans forward and tells me these are serious warning signs. They require immediate attention and possibly more help than he can provide alone. I feel like someone just pulled the floor out from under me. My hands are shaking and I grip the arms of the chair to steady them. I ask if my son said he wants to hurt himself. Marco shakes his head and says no, nothing that direct. But the level of despair he's showing is bad enough that Marco is recommending more help. He wants both parents involved now. He needs to bring my wife into this. I have to tell him that my wife doesn't know about these sessions, that she's going to be beyond angry when she finds out. Marco nods like he expected this. He says he understands that's difficult, but at this point my son's safety matters more than parental conflict. He's going to call my wife today. He's going to request a joint meeting with both of us. I try to argue, but Marco cuts me off gently. He says this isn't optional anymore. The school has a responsibility when a student shows these kinds of warning signs. I sit there feeling sick. All I wanted was to help my son, and now I've created a situation that's going to explode in my face. Marco gives me a minute to process. Then he asks if there's anything else I need to tell him about the home situation. I find myself explaining about the swimming and the restrictions and how my wife sees danger everywhere. Marco takes more notes. He says this helps him understand the context better. He promises he'll handle the call to my wife carefully, but he has to make it happen today. I drive home in a fog. My brain keeps replaying Marco's words. Hopelessness, no control, wishing he could disappear. How did I let it get this bad? How did I not see how much he was suffering? I pull into the driveway and my wife's car is already there even though it's barely 3 in the afternoon. She never comes home early. I walk in and she's standing in the kitchen with her phone in her hand and her face is red. She sees me and starts yelling immediately. She wants to know why I authorized counseling behind her back. What lies has our son been telling this counselor? Why did I go around her like she doesn't matter? I try to explain that I was worried about him, that he seemed so depressed and I thought talking to someone might help. She cuts me off and says secular counselors don't understand spiritual warfare, that our son is being coached to see normal parenting as abuse, that this is exactly what happens when you let the world into your family. The fight that follows is worse than any we've ever had. We're both yelling. My son's door upstairs stays closed and I know he can hear everything. My wife's voice gets louder as she accuses me of conspiring with outsiders. She says I'm undermining her authority and poisoning our son against her faith. I tell her that our son is suffering, that she's too blinded by fear to see what's happening to him. She responds that I'm too weak to protect him from a corrupt world. That's why God gave mothers stronger instincts, she says. Her voice is shaking now. I mention that Marco used words like hopelessness and despair to describe our son's state. She laughs, but it's not a real laugh. She says that's what happens when you let secular people into a child's mind instead of filling it with scripture. That counselors like Marco are trained to see problems where there aren't any, to make children doubt their parents. I ask her if she's even listening to herself. Our son told someone he wishes he could disappear. She goes quiet for a second. Then she says he wouldn't feel that way if I hadn't been questioning her decisions and making him think he should have more freedom. She blames me for all of it. The argument ends when my wife declares she's calling her pastor right now. She's calling her parents too. We're going to have proper Christian counseling instead of this secular garbage. I tell her I'm not stopping the school counseling no matter what her pastor says. She stares at me like she's seeing a stranger. She says I've changed, that I'm not the man she married, that the man she married would have trusted her spiritual discernment. I respond that maybe I'm finally becoming the father our son actually needs, instead of the one who just keeps peace. She turns and walks out of the room. I hear her footsteps on the stairs and then her bedroom door slams. That night I sleep in the guest room. I can hear my wife on the phone through the wall. Her voice rises and falls for hours. I assume she's talking to her parents and her pastor, building her case against me. Around 10, there's a soft knock on my door. I open it and my son is standing there in his pajamas. His eyes are red. He asks me quietly if we're getting divorced. I want to lie and tell him everything will be fine, but I can't do that anymore. I tell him honestly that I don't know what's going to happen, but I promise him I'm not going to stop fighting for him to have a normal life, for him to do things he loves, for him to not have to live in fear all the time. He doesn't say anything for a minute. Then he steps forward and hugs me tighter than he has in years. He whispers thank you against my shoulder. Then he goes back to his room and closes the door softly. The next morning, my wife is already dressed and waiting in the kitchen when I come downstairs. She informs me that her pastor wants to meet with both of us. Her parents are driving up this weekend to help us work through this crisis. The way she says crisis makes it clear she thinks I'm the crisis. I agree to meet with the pastor because refusing would just make things worse. But I tell her I'm also continuing to work with Marco, and with the attorney I consulted last week. Her face goes completely pale when I mention the attorney. She asks if I'm planning to divorce her. Her voice is smaller now, almost scared. I tell her I'm planning to protect our son. What happens to our marriage depends on whether she can see that her restrictions are actually hurting him. She doesn't respond. She just picks up her purse and leaves for her Bible study without another word. I sit at the kitchen table for a long time after she's gone. Then I make a decision. I pull out my phone and call Coach Marguerite. She answers on the second ring. I explain that the situation at home has gotten worse, that my wife and I are barely speaking, that I'm trying to help my son but everything is falling apart. I ask if there's any way my son could attend just one practice, just to see his old teammates, just to be in the water again for an hour. Coach Marguerite doesn't hesitate. She says yes immediately. She'll mark him as a guest so there's no problem with enrollment. She says to bring him by Friday afternoon. I thank her and my voice cracks a little. She tells me she's been coaching for 15 years and she's seen parents fight over sports before. She says I'm doing the right thing by putting my son first. That swimming isn't just a sport for kids like him, it's where they find themselves. Friday afternoon, I pick my son up from the school. He gets in the car and asks where we're going. I tell him we're going to the pool. His whole face changes. He asks if Mom knows and I tell him no, not yet. But I'm handling it. He doesn't say anything else, but I can see him trying not to smile, trying not to hope too much in case this gets taken away again. We drive to the rec center and I park in the lot. My son gets out slowly, like he's not sure this is real. We walk in and the smell of chlorine hits us immediately. His shoulders relax. We head to the pool deck and Coach Marguerite sees us and waves. The other kids notice my son and several of them run over. They're asking where he's been and saying they missed him. My son is smiling for real now. Coach Marguerite tells him to get changed and join them for warm-ups. Watching my son back in the water is like watching someone come back to life. He dives in and his form is still strong even after a month away. He's laughing and joking with the other kids between laps. During a break, Coach Marguerite pulls me aside. She says she can see the difference in him immediately. The tension he was carrying is gone. This is where he belongs, she tells me. I watch him swim another lap and I know she's right. When practice ends, my son comes over dripping wet and grinning. He thanks me. Then he thanks me again in the car. Then a third time when we pull into our driveway. I tell him he doesn't have to keep thanking me. He says yes he does because this is the first time in forever that someone chose what he wanted over what was easier. My wife is waiting in the kitchen when we pull into the driveway. I can see her through the window standing by the sink with her arms crossed. My son notices too and his smile fades. He looks at me and I tell him it's going to be okay. We walk in through the garage door and she's right there. She looks at my son's wet hair and then at me. She doesn't say anything at first. She just walks over to him and leans in close. She smells the chlorine on him and her whole face changes. She steps back and asks where we've been. My son looks at the floor. I tell her we went to the pool. She asks if I deliberately went against her decision. I say yes. I took him to swim practice because it makes him happy and there's nothing wrong with that. She turns to my son and tells him to go to his room. He leaves without looking at either of us. Once he's gone, she asks me if I understand what I've just done. I tell her I gave our son an hour of doing something he loves. She says I've proven I can't be trusted. She says she's going to have to take more direct action to protect him from my poor judgment. I ask what that means, and she doesn't answer. She just walks past me and goes upstairs. The next 2 days are silent. My wife doesn't speak to me except to tell me that her pastor wants to meet with both of us. I agree because refusing would make things worse. The meeting is on Thursday evening at the church. We drive there separately. I get there first and wait in the parking lot. When she arrives, she walks straight inside without acknowledging me. I follow her in. The pastor's office is small with a desk and 3 chairs. He's already sitting behind the desk when we walk in. He stands up and shakes my wife's hand and then mine. He tells us to sit down. My wife sits in the chair closest to his desk. I take the other one. The pastor opens with a prayer asking for wisdom and guidance. Then he looks at me and says, my wife has shared her concerns about our son's activities. He says he wants to hear my perspective. I start to explain that our son loves swimming and that pulling him from the team has hurt him emotionally. The pastor holds up his hand. He says he understands my concern, but that there are spiritual dangers I might not be seeing. He says wives are called to be keepers of the home. He says mothers have special God-given insight into protecting children. I try to tell him about Marco's concerns and the counseling sessions. He cuts me off. He says worldly psychology contradicts biblical truth. He says secular counselors don't understand spiritual warfare. He looks at my wife and nods like she's been right all along. Then he turns back to me. He says I need to repent for my rebellion against my wife's spiritual authority. He says I need to trust that God will honor her obedience, even if I can't see the wisdom in it. I sit there listening to him talk about submission and spiritual headship and protecting children from corruption. My wife is nodding along with everything he says. I realize nothing I say will change this man's mind. Fighting with him will only make my wife more certain she's right. So I just sit there. I let him finish his lecture. When he's done, he asks if I'm willing to support my wife's decisions. I tell him I'll think about what he said. It's not a yes, and it's not a no. The meeting ends with another prayer. We walk out to the parking lot and my wife looks pleased. She says she's glad I heard what the pastor had to say. I don't tell her that I've already decided his opinion doesn't matter, but I think she can see something in my face because she goes quiet on the drive home. Saturday morning, my wife's parents arrive. Her father is a tall man who worked in construction his whole life. Her mother is small and talks constantly. They hug my wife at the door and shake my hand. My wife has already told them everything. Her father pulls me aside within an hour of them arriving. He tells me we need to talk man to man. We go out to the back porch. He starts by saying he respects me, but that I need to understand something. He says I'm the spiritual head of the household and that means I need to lead. But then he says that when it comes to raising children, mothers have a special understanding. He says my wife is doing what's best for our son, even if I can't see it yet. He says I need to support her decisions and stop undermining her authority. I listen without arguing. There's no point. He's going to take his daughter's side no matter what I say. Inside the house, my wife's mother has cornered my son in the living room. I can see them through the window. She's talking to him, and he's sitting there with his shoulders hunched. Later that evening, my son tells me she gave him a long talk about honoring his parents and trusting their wisdom. The whole weekend feels like an intervention. My wife's parents stay until Sunday evening. Her father lectures me twice more. Her mother keeps making comments about how children today are too spoiled and need stricter guidance. I spend most of the weekend in the garage planning my next steps. When they finally leave, my wife seems confident that they've helped set me straight. Sunday evening, after her parents drive away, my wife asks me to sit down at the kitchen table. She says she's been thinking about everything and she wants to offer a compromise. I sit down across from her. She says she'll allow our son to return to swimming if I agree to some conditions. I ask what conditions. She lists them out. First, I need to attend her church's men's group every week. Second, our son needs to attend youth group 3 times a week. Third, we need to switch him to a Christian school next year. She sits back and waits for my answer. I look at her and realize this isn't a compromise at all. This is her trying to bring me under the same control system she's built around our son. Every condition is designed to surround me with people who think like she does, to pressure me into falling in line. I tell her no. Her face changes. She asks what I mean. I say I'm not agreeing to those terms. She says she's trying to meet me halfway. I tell her that's not halfway. That's her way with a different label. She stands up. She asks what I want from her. I tell her honestly that I want her to see that our son is suffering. I want her to see that her restrictions are crushing his spirit. She says temporary suffering is better than eternal damnation. She says she'd rather have him resent her now than lose his soul later. I realize we're speaking completely different languages. There may be no middle ground here. I tell my wife I'm going to re-enroll our son in swimming. I tell her I'll handle all the transportation and attendance at practices. She can choose not to be involved if that's what she wants. But I'm not backing down on this. Her face goes white. She says if I do that, she'll follow through on her threat to leave and file for custody. I look at her and tell her I've spoken to a family law attorney. I tell her I'm prepared for that possibility. I tell her I think a judge will be very interested in hearing about our son's emotional state and the school counselor's concerns. She stares at me. She asks if I'm really willing to destroy our family over swimming. I tell her I'm willing to protect our son's well-being. What happens to our marriage depends on whether she can accept that. She leaves the room. I hear her on the phone upstairs for hours. The week after that conversation is the coldest our house has ever been. My wife and I barely speak except about logistics. She tells me when dinner is ready. I tell her when I'll be home late. That's it. My son notices the tension, but he seems less anxious than before. Like he can sense that something is finally shifting. On Wednesday, I go online and submit the re-enrollment forms to the swim team. I pay the fee with my credit card. Then I go to my son's room and tell him he's officially back on the team starting next week. His whole face lights up. He asks if I'm serious. I tell him yes. He jumps up and hugs me. Then he pulls back and asks if Mom knows. I tell him not yet, but that I'm handling it. He looks worried but also hopeful. Like he's afraid to trust that this is really happening, but he can't help hoping anyway. Thursday evening, my wife is on the computer in the kitchen. I'm making dinner. She suddenly stops scrolling and her whole body goes rigid. She clicks on something. Then she turns to look at me. She asks if I enrolled our son in swimming. I tell her yes. She asks when. I tell her Wednesday. She stands up and walks over to me. She says I've forced her hand. She says she's calling her attorney tomorrow. I turn off the stove. I tell her I'm sorry it's come to this, but I'm not backing down. I tell her I hope she'll reconsider before taking legal action that will hurt our son more than it hurts either of us. She doesn't respond. She just goes upstairs. I finish making dinner, but neither of us eats. Friday morning, I wake up early. I walk downstairs and see 2 suitcases by the front door. My wife comes down the stairs with my son behind her. He's still in his pajamas. He looks confused. My wife says she's taking him to her parents' house. I tell her calmly that if she removes our son from the home without my agreement, it could look very bad in custody proceedings. She stops. She looks at me, trying to figure out if I'm bluffing. I pull out my phone and show her Verity's number on speed dial. I ask if she really wants to start this fight right now. I ask if we can try to work something out for our son's sake. She stands there for a long moment. Then she tells my son to go back upstairs. He looks at me. I nod. He goes. My wife picks up the suitcases and carries them back upstairs. She doesn't say another word to me. She moves into the guest room that afternoon. I watch my wife carry the suitcases back upstairs, her movements stiff and angry. She doesn't look at me. She doesn't say another word. The guest room door closes with a quiet click that somehow feels louder than slamming would have been. My son stands at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, looking confused and scared. I tell him to get dressed for school and that everything is okay. He nods, but I can see he doesn't believe me. Neither do I, really. The house feels different now, like something broke that can't be fixed. My wife moves her clothes into the guest room over the next few days. She takes her pillow and her books and the small lamp from her nightstand. She doesn't ask for help, and I don't offer. We pass each other in the hallway like strangers. She makes dinner but leaves mine on the stove instead of calling me to the table. I eat alone while she and our son sit in the dining room in silence. My son keeps glancing toward the kitchen like he wants to say something but doesn't know what. After dinner, he goes to his room and I hear him on the phone with someone, his voice low and careful. I wonder if he's talking to one of his teammates. I hope he is. Wednesday afternoon, I drive my son to his first practice back. He's quiet in the car, fiddling with his swim bag. He asks if Mom is really okay with this. I tell him the truth, that she's not okay with it, but I am, and that's what matters right now. He processes that for a minute. Then he asks what happens if she tries to pull him out again. I promise him I won't let that happen. He looks at me like he's trying to decide if he can trust that promise. I don't blame him for hesitating. At the pool, I walk him inside, and Coach Marguerite greets us both with a warm smile. She tells my son she's glad to have him back and asks if he remembers his stroke drills. He nods and heads to the locker room. She touches my arm and says quietly that she's seen situations like this before, that some parents struggle with letting their kids have independence. I thank her for being patient with our family. She says my son is worth it, that he has real potential if he's allowed to develop it. Watching him dive into the pool feels like watching him come back to life. His form is still good. His timing is still there. He swims his warm-up laps with focus and energy I haven't seen in weeks. When I pick him up after practice, he's exhausted but smiling. He tells me about his times, how Coach Marguerite said he hasn't lost much speed despite the month away. He talks about the relay team and an upcoming meet and which events he wants to focus on. I listen and feel something loosen in my chest. This is what he needed. This is who he is when he's allowed to be himself. At home, my wife is in the guest room with the door closed. My son glances at it as we pass but doesn't say anything. He goes to his room to do homework. I make dinner and call him when it's ready. My wife doesn't come out. I leave a plate outside her door. Later that night, I hear her moving around, going to the bathroom, getting water from the kitchen. We don't speak. The next morning, she's up early and gone before my son wakes up. He asks where she is, and I tell him she went to church. He asks if she's ever coming back. I tell him she lives here, she's just upset right now. He looks worried but also relieved, like part of him wouldn't mind if she stayed gone. That thought scares me. My phone rings Friday afternoon while I'm at work. It's Verity. She says my wife's attorney contacted her office about a potential custody case. My stomach drops. Verity says we need to meet immediately to prepare. I leave work early and drive to her office downtown. In her conference room, Verity spreads out papers and opens her laptop. She explains that my wife's attorney sent a preliminary letter outlining their position. They're going to claim I'm exposing our son to immoral influences against my wife's religious convictions. They're going to argue that her religious freedom should be respected in custody arrangements. Verity says this is actually a weaker argument than she expected because it relies heavily on religious freedom without addressing our son's actual well-being. I ask what we need to do. She says we need documentation of everything. My son's emotional decline before I re-enrolled him. The school counselor's concerns. Any evidence that my wife's restrictions were causing him harm. We spend 2 hours going through Marco's notes and emails. I show her the text messages from the week my son was withdrawn and barely eating. I describe the conversation where my son said mom always wins anyway. Verity takes detailed notes and says, this is exactly what we need. She explains that family court focuses on the best interests of the child, not on which parent has the most righteous beliefs. The pattern of my wife isolating our son from normal activities and the documented impact on his mental health will be our strongest argument. Verity asks about my wife's support network. I tell her about the church community, her pastor who validated her decision, her parents who think I'm being weak. She nods seriously and says that support network could work against us if they testify that my wife is a devoted mother protecting her child. But she also says their extreme views might actually help our case if they come across as unreasonable to a judge. She advises me to keep detailed notes of every incident from now on. Save all text messages and emails. Document every time my son comes home happy from swimming, and every time my wife refuses to acknowledge his activities. Build a clear timeline that shows the difference in his well-being before and after I stood up to her restrictions. I leave her office feeling both empowered and terrified. This is really happening. We're heading toward a custody battle. The thought makes me sick, but doing nothing would be worse. I sit in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes trying to steady my breathing. My phone buzzes with a text from my son asking what's for dinner. I force myself to focus on that simple question and drive home. Marco calls me Monday morning and asks if I can come in for a meeting. I tell my boss I have a family emergency and leave work. In Marco's office, he looks more serious than usual. He says my son has been talking about the changes at home during their sessions. He seems both hopeful and anxious about what's happening. He's worried about his parents splitting up, but also relieved that someone is finally fighting for him to have normal experiences. Marco pauses and looks at me directly. He says my son told him that for the first time in years, he feels like maybe his life doesn't have to be completely controlled by fear. That his dad is actually standing up for him instead of just saying he will. Marco says he's willing to testify if needed about the emotional state my son was in before and the improvement he's seeing now. The weight of that offer hits me hard. This counselor who barely knows us is willing to go to court to help my son. I thank him and my voice cracks a little. He says he's seen too many kids crushed by well-meaning parents who can't see the damage they're causing. He says my son deserves better and he's glad someone is fighting for him. Walking out of the school building, I feel the full reality of what's coming. This isn't just a fight with my wife anymore. This is testimony and documentation and legal proceedings. This is other people examining our family and deciding what's best for our son. This is terrifyingly real. I call Jason that afternoon and ask if he and Michaela can meet with me. We set up dinner at their house for Wednesday. When I arrive, they have the kids occupied upstairs, and the three of us sit in their living room. I explain everything that's happened since I re-enrolled my son. The guest room situation, the custody attorney, Marco's offer to testify. Jason and Michaela listen without interrupting. When I finish, Michaela asks me a question I haven't let myself think about. She asks what I actually want the outcome to be. Am I trying to save my marriage or just protect my son? I start to say both, but the words stick. I sit there for a long moment, realizing I don't know anymore. My marriage feels like it's already over. My wife and I can't even be in the same room. We can't agree on the most basic aspects of parenting. I tell them honestly that I don't know if my marriage can be saved when we have such fundamentally different views about how to raise our son. Michaela nods gently. She says that staying in a marriage where I have to constantly fight for my son's well-being isn't sustainable for anyone. Not for me, not for my wife, and especially not for my son. She says sometimes the most loving thing is to create healthy, separate environments where both parents can have relationships with their child without the constant conflict. Jason adds that my son is already seeing the difference between a home where he's controlled and a home where he's supported. That clarity will only get stronger as this process continues. I feel something shift inside me as they talk. I've been trying to save a marriage that might not be worth saving. I've been afraid of divorce when maybe divorce is actually the answer that gives my son the best chance at a healthy life. 3 weeks after I re-enrolled my son in swimming, a process server shows up at my door. I sign for the envelope and my hands shake even though I knew this was coming. Inside are custody papers, official legal documents with case numbers and court stamps. My wife is asking for primary custody with supervised visitation for me. The petition claims I'm exposing our son to harmful influences against her religious convictions. It describes the swim team as an environment that normalizes immodesty and temptation. It argues that her religious freedom as a parent should be protected and respected. I read through the whole thing twice, feeling sick. Then I call Verity. She tells me to bring the papers to her office immediately. An hour later, we're sitting in her conference room, and she's reading through everything with a pen in hand. She makes notes in the margins and circles certain phrases. When she finishes, she looks up and says, "This is actually weaker than she expected." The entire argument relies on religious freedom without addressing our son's well-being at all. There's no mention of his emotional state, his documented decline, or the improvement since he returned to activities. It's all about my wife's beliefs and her right to parent according to those beliefs. Verity says this gives us strong grounds to fight it. Family court isn't about whose beliefs are more valid, it's about what's best for the child. And we have documentation that our son suffered under her restrictions and improved when those restrictions were lifted. She says we're going to counter with our own filing asking for primary custody with regular visitation for my wife. We're going to show the pattern of psychological harm her restrictions caused and argue that our son needs a primary home where he's allowed to be a normal kid. The hardest part is telling my son about the custody case. I wait until after dinner when he's relaxed from swim practice. I sit on his bed and try to explain it in terms he can understand. I tell him that his mom and I are having trouble agreeing about what's best for him, so we're going to let a judge help us figure it out. He's quiet for a minute. Then he asks if he has to choose between us. I tell him that's not how it works. The judge will care about what's best for him and his opinion matters, but he's not the one making the choice. He processes that. Then he asks me something that breaks my heart. He asks if his mom even wants him if she's trying to control everything he does. I feel my throat tighten. I don't have a good answer. I tell him his mom loves him very much. She just shows it in ways that aren't always healthy. I tell him she's scared of losing him, either to the world or to me, and that fear makes her try to control everything. He nods slowly. Then he says something that surprises me. He says he's not scared anymore. He was scared when Mom pulled him from swimming and he thought he'd never get to go back. But now he's more worried about having to live with her full-time again. He asks if there's any way he can tell the judge that he wants to live with me. I tell him that when kids are 12, judges do listen to what they want. He looks relieved. Then he hugs me and says, "Thank you for not giving up this time." I hold him and feel the weight of every time I did give up before. Marco calls me in after my son's next counseling session. He says something significant happened today. My son asked if he could talk to the judge himself. Marco explained that at 12, he's old enough that his preferences will be considered, and he asked what my son would want to say. Marco pulls out his notes and reads me what my son told him. He said he feels like he's been suffocating under his mom's rules, that he's missed his friends and activities and feeling like a normal kid, that he's finally feeling like he can breathe again now that he's back swimming. Marco documented all of this carefully and says, my son's clarity about his own needs is actually a positive sign of emotional recovery. Kids who've been controlled for a long time often struggle to articulate what they want. But my son knows. He knows what makes him feel alive and what makes him feel crushed. Marco says this kind of self-awareness will be powerful in court. Judges pay attention when kids can clearly express their own experiences. I thank Marco for everything he's doing. He says he's just giving my son space to find his voice. The real credit goes to my son for being brave enough to use it. Driving home, I feel this strange mix of pride and grief. Pride that my son is finding his strength. Grief that he had to suffer so much before anyone listened. The mediation session happens on a Tuesday morning at my wife's attorney's office. Verity warned me this would be tense. My wife's attorney presents what they call a compromise. My wife will agree to joint custody if I agree to certain conditions. Our son can swim, but only at practices where male and female swimmers are separated. He can have friends, but she gets to approve them based on their family's values. He can participate in the school activities, but nothing that conflicts with church events. I listen to the whole list and feel my jaw tighten. This isn't a compromise. This is her original restrictions with minor modifications. Verity starts to respond, but I hold up my hand. I look at my wife across the table. She won't meet my eyes. I tell her that I love her. I tell her I know she believes she's protecting our son. But I tell her I love our son more than I love our marriage, and I can't agree to anything that puts him back in the emotional prison she's built. I tell her I'm willing to share custody fairly, but only if she agrees to stop restricting his normal activities and relationships. Only if she lets him be a kid without constant fear and control. And if she can't do that, I'm prepared to fight for primary custody. I tell her our son deserves a home where he can breathe. The room is completely silent. My wife's face hardens. She looks at me with something close to hatred. She says I've chosen the world over God. She says our son will suffer for my weakness. I take a breath. I tell her I've chosen our son's well-being over her fear. I tell her I hope someday she'll see the difference. But I'm done negotiating with restrictions disguised as compromises. Verity closes her folder and says, I think we're done here. My wife's attorney tries to salvage something, but Verity cuts him off. She says we'll see them in court. We stand up and leave. In the parking lot, Verity tells me we're heading for a custody trial. Full proceedings with testimony and evidence and a judge's ruling. I feel sick about it. But I also feel relieved that I've finally drawn a line I won't cross, even if it costs me my marriage. The next few weeks blur together in a mess of attorney meetings and documentation gathering and court preparation. I meet with Verity twice a week to go over everything. We organize Marco's notes chronologically to show the timeline of my son's emotional decline and recovery. We get statements from his teachers about the changes they've noticed in his participation and mood. We collect Coach Marguerite's observations about his renewed energy and focus. We build a case that shows clearly what happens to my son under my wife's restrictions versus what happens when he's allowed normal activities and relationships. At home, my son continues swimming 4 times a week. His improvement is visible not just in the pool, but in his whole demeanor. He laughs more. He talks about the future. He makes plans with teammates. His teachers report he's participating more in class discussions. Marco says he's opening up more in counseling sessions and processing his feelings in healthier ways. Coach Marguerite pulls me aside after practice one day and says she's never seen a kid bounce back so fast from being away from the sport. She says whatever I'm doing at home is working. I don't tell her it's mostly just letting him be himself. My wife and I barely interact during this time. She stays in the guest room. She leaves for church or her prayer group most evenings. When we do cross paths, the air feels heavy with everything unsaid. My son has stopped trying to engage with her. He answers her questions with one-word responses and spends most of his time in his room or at practice. I watch their relationship crumble and feel helpless to stop it. But I also know that relationship was already broken by her need to control him. Maybe this separation will eventually allow them to rebuild something healthier. Or maybe it won't. Either way, my son is finally safe to be himself. Jason recommended a church on the other side of town, where a pastor named Darren Newton led services that felt different from the first moment I walked through the doors. The building was smaller and less formal than my wife's church, with worn carpet and folding chairs instead of polished pews. Darren's sermon that first Sunday was about how God's love sets people free rather than trapping them in fear, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. After the service, I introduced myself and explained I was going through a custody situation, and Darren listened without the judgment I'd come to expect from religious leaders. He offered to meet with me during the week to talk more, and when I arrived at his office 3 days later, he asked thoughtful questions about my son's well-being and my wife's restrictions, without once suggesting I was abandoning my faith. I told him about the swimming and the isolation, and the pattern of control disguised as spiritual protection, and Darren nodded like he'd seen this before. He said healthy faith communities support children's growth and curiosity rather than shutting down their interests and relationships. When I mentioned the custody case, he offered without hesitation to provide a statement for court about how my approach to parenting aligned with healthy spiritual development. I left his office feeling validated in a way I hadn't felt in years, like maybe choosing my son's well-being over my wife's demands wasn't the betrayal she claimed it was. The deposition happened in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and cleaning supplies, with my wife's attorney sitting across from me and a court reporter typing every word. The questions started friendly enough, asking about my background and my marriage and my relationship with my son. Then they shifted to my faith practices, and whether I still believed in the Bible's authority, and whether I thought secular activities were more important than spiritual formation. The attorney kept circling back to the swimming, asking if I understood that I was exposing my son to an environment that normalized immodesty, and whether I cared more about athletic achievement than his moral development. I kept my voice steady, and brought every answer back to my son's documented emotional decline under my wife's restrictions and his visible improvement since returning to swimming. I mentioned Marco's concerns about hopelessness and withdrawal, the school counselor's notes about his isolation, and the concrete evidence that my son was healthier when he had normal activities and friendships. The attorney tried to frame Marco's secular counseling as undermining Christian values, but I pointed out that my son's faith wasn't in danger from swimming laps or having friends. It was in danger from learning that God's love came with impossible conditions. After 2 hours, Verity called a break and pulled me aside to say I'd done well, that their case was still relying too heavily on religious freedom arguments without addressing the actual harm their restrictions caused. She said judges care about children's well-being more than parents' theological interpretations, and our documentation of my son's suffering under my wife's control was stronger than their claims about spiritual protection. The custody evaluator was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a notebook she filled constantly during our meetings. She spent 3 hours at my apartment asking questions about my parenting approach and my son's daily routine and how I handled discipline and emotional support. I showed her his swim schedule and explained how we'd built structure around practices and homework and time with friends, and she took notes about the balance between activities and rest. When she met with my wife, the evaluator spent just as long at the house I used to share, and my wife apparently talked extensively about spiritual warfare and the dangers of secular influences. The evaluator's expression when she told me about it later suggested my wife's intensity had registered as concerning rather than righteous. The home visit at my place happened on a Wednesday evening when my son was making dinner with me, and the evaluator watched us joke around while chopping vegetables and noted how relaxed he seemed. At my wife's house during her visit the following week, my son was noticeably quieter and more careful with his words, and the evaluator documented the difference in her report. The final interview happened just with my son, and when the evaluator asked him directly what he wanted, he said clearly that he wanted to live primarily with me, but still see his mom regularly. He said he wanted to keep swimming and have normal friendships and not feel like every interest or activity was something he had to defend or justify. The evaluator asked if he loved both his parents, and he said yes immediately, but then added that loving his mom was easier when he didn't have to live under her rules all the time. I built a routine for my son that became the backbone of our new life together, with swimming practice 4 mornings a week before school and twice on weekends. Marco continued seeing him every Wednesday during lunch period, and those sessions became a safe space where my son could process the ongoing tension with his mother and his anxiety about the custody proceedings. Jason and Michaela invited us over most Friday nights, and their son Lowell started mentoring my son, both in swimming technique and in navigating the social dynamics of being a competitive athlete. Watching them in the pool together, or talking about training strategies made me realize how much my son had been missing by not having older role models who shared his interests. My son started smiling more during those weeks, making jokes at dinner and talking about upcoming swim meets with genuine excitement rather than the guarded hope he'd shown before. His grades improved as his stress decreased, and his teachers reported he was participating more in class discussions and seemed more confident overall. These changes became central to our custody case, with Marco documenting the week-by-week improvement in my son's emotional state and Verity collecting statements from his teachers about the visible difference in his engagement and mood. Coach Marguerite provided detailed notes about his renewed focus and energy in the pool, and how his times were improving steadily as he regained the conditioning he'd lost during the month away from the team. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion, that my son thrived when he had normal activities and supportive relationships, and suffered when those things were restricted in the name of spiritual protection. The custody evaluator's report arrived in Verity's office 6 weeks after the evaluation process ended, and she called me immediately to say it was strongly in our favor. The report recommended primary custody to me with regular visitation for my wife, citing specific concerns about her restrictive parenting style and its documented negative impact on our son's emotional health. The evaluator had included detailed observations about the difference in my son's demeanor between our 2 homes, noting that he was noticeably more relaxed and talkative at my place compared to the careful, guarded behavior he showed at his mother's house. The report specifically mentioned the dramatic improvement in his well-being since returning to swimming and having more autonomy over his activities and friendships. It recommended that any custody arrangement should prioritize maintaining his current routine and support systems, including his swim team, his school counseling, and his relationship with Jason and Michaela's family. My wife's attorney immediately filed a motion challenging the report, arguing that it relied too heavily on secular psychological standards and didn't give proper weight to a mother's religious convictions about child rearing. Verity said this response actually strengthened our position because it showed how out of touch their arguments were with actual child welfare standards. She explained that courts don't ignore religious beliefs, but they also don't let those beliefs override documented harm to a child's mental health, and our case had extensive documentation of that harm under my wife's restrictions. 2 weeks before the trial date, Verity got a call from my wife's attorney requesting a settlement discussion. My wife was apparently willing to agree to joint custody with me having primary physical custody if I would agree to certain conditions about our son's religious education and church attendance. We met in Verity's conference room to negotiate the terms, with my wife and her attorney on one side and Verity and me on the other. The conditions they proposed included mandatory church attendance with his mother every Sunday, enrollment in a Christian youth group, and my agreement to consult with my wife before allowing our son to participate in any new activities or form new friendships. I listened to the whole list and then said I would agree that our son could attend church with his mother during her visitation time and that I would support his spiritual development in whatever form felt right to him. But I wouldn't agree to any restrictions on his activities or friendships based on my wife's religious interpretations, and I wouldn't give her veto power over normal aspects of his social and extracurricular life. Her attorney pushed back hard, saying my wife needed assurance that her values would be respected in our son's upbringing. Verity responded calmly that respecting values was different from allowing those values to control and restrict a child's development, and that the custody evaluator's report made clear which approach served our son's best interests. We negotiated for 3 hours, going back and forth on specific language about religious education and decision-making authority. Eventually, we reached terms I could live with, where my wife would have regular, meaningful time with our son, but wouldn't have the power to restrict his activities or isolate him from normal childhood experiences. The final settlement agreement spelled out custody arrangements in careful legal language that protected my son while maintaining his relationship with both parents. He would live primarily with me during the school year, with Wednesday evening dinners at his mother's house and alternating weekends from Friday after school through Sunday evening. Holidays would be split with Thanksgiving alternating years, and Christmas divided between Christmas Eve with one parent and Christmas Day with the other. My wife agreed explicitly not to interfere with his swimming or other extracurricular activities, and we would share decision-making about major issues like education and medical care, with a requirement to consult each other before making significant changes. The agreement included a provision that either parent could request modification if circumstances changed substantially, but any modification would need to prioritize our son's emotional well-being and maintain his current support systems. It wasn't perfect, and I knew my wife was deeply unhappy with terms that limited her control over his daily life and activities. But it protected our son from the restrictions that had been crushing him while giving him regular time with his mother in manageable doses. Verity reviewed every clause with me carefully, making sure I understood both my rights and my responsibilities under the agreement. When I signed the papers, my hand shook slightly, knowing this document represented the formal end of my marriage and the beginning of a new structure for our family. My wife and I met one last time before the final signing, sitting across from each other in a neutral conference room with no attorneys present. She looked tired and older than I remembered, with lines around her eyes that seemed deeper than they'd been months ago. She told me she believed I was making a terrible mistake and that I would regret prioritizing worldly activities over spiritual protection. She said our son would grow up without proper moral guidance and would one day understand that she had been trying to save him from corruption. I listened without interrupting and then told her honestly that I believed our son would grow into a healthy, faithful adult because he was learning that faith didn't require fear and control. I said he was discovering that God's love could coexist with normal childhood experiences and that spiritual development didn't mean isolation from the world. She shook her head and said I was naive, that I couldn't see the dangers she saw because I'd never taken spiritual warfare seriously enough. I told her I hoped that over time she would see our son thriving with more freedom and realize that her fears hadn't come true. I said I hoped she could eventually find peace with the arrangement and focus on building a healthier relationship with him during her visitation time. She didn't respond for a long moment, just stared at her hands folded on the table. When she finally looked up, there was something in her eyes that might have been doubt or might have been exhaustion, some crack in the certainty she'd always carried like armor. We stood up and left without saying anything else, and I drove home knowing that conversation was the closest thing to closure we would get. 6 weeks after the custody arrangement was finalized, my son was flourishing in ways I hadn't known were possible. He made the top relay team at swimming, beating his previous times consistently and earning praise from Coach Marguerite about his improved technique and endurance. His grades jumped from mostly B's and C's to mostly A's and B's, and his teachers reported he was participating actively in class discussions and showing genuine curiosity about the material. He made several new friends at the school, kids who shared his interests in swimming and video games and normal 12-year-old activities. The Wednesday evening visits with his mother were tense, according to what he told me, with her still trying to control what he talked about and how he spent his time during those few hours. But he said the visits were manageable because they were short and because he knew he was coming home to my place afterward where he could breathe. The alternating weekend visits were harder, full days where his mother tried to fill every moment with church activities and Bible study and conversations about spiritual warfare. My son learned to endure them by keeping his responses brief and his real thoughts private, which wasn't ideal, but was better than the constant conflict that had defined their relationship before. Marco continued seeing him weekly and reported that my son's emotional recovery was progressing well, though he still struggled with anxiety about disappointing people and needed ongoing support to build healthier patterns. But the overall trajectory was unmistakably positive. A kid who'd been shutting down and giving up was now engaged with his life and excited about his future. I asked my son one evening if we could talk about everything that had happened, and we sat on the couch in my apartment with the TV off and the room quiet. I apologized for not standing up to his mother sooner, for all the years he spent feeling trapped and believing no one would fight for him. I told him I should have drawn boundaries much earlier, instead of letting things escalate to the point where legal intervention was necessary. He was quiet for a minute, and then said he wasn't angry at me anymore, that he understood I'd been trying to keep the family together, and that must have been really hard. Then he said something that made my eyes sting with tears, that he was glad I finally chose him, even though it meant our family breaking apart. He said he'd spent so long thinking his mom's rules were just how life had to be, and that seeing me fight for him to have normal experiences had changed how he saw himself and what he deserved. I promised him I would always choose his well-being first from now on, that I would never again let anyone make him feel like his interests and friendships and dreams were wrong or dangerous. He smiled and said he believed me, and then asked if we could order pizza and watch a movie. We spent the rest of the evening doing exactly that, just being together without tension or fear, and I felt grateful for every difficult choice that had led us to this moment of peace. The co-parenting app on my phone became the main way my wife and I communicated. Short messages about pickup times and doctor appointments that kept things practical without getting emotional. She dropped our son off Wednesday evenings at 6 and picked him up at 8, 2 hours that felt tense according to what he told me, but were manageable because they had clear boundaries. The alternating weekends were harder, full days Saturday and Sunday where she filled every moment with church activities and Bible studies and conversations about staying pure. My son learned to give short answers and keep his real thoughts to himself during those visits, which wasn't what I wanted for him, but was better than the constant fighting that used to happen. He told me one Wednesday after she dropped him off that his mom had started going to a different church, one that wasn't quite as strict about everything. She'd mentioned it casually during their dinner together, saying the new pastor talked more about God's love than about all the dangers in the world. I asked if she seemed happier, and my son shrugged, said she seemed less angry maybe, but still watched everything he said like she was waiting for him to mess up. The legal paperwork for our separation sat in a folder on my kitchen counter, forms we'd both signed agreeing to finalize the divorce after 6 months of living apart. Neither of us talked about it directly, but the reality hung between every interaction. This marriage that had lasted 11 years now reduced to logistics and scheduling. I felt sad about it most days, mourning the life we'd planned together and the family we'd tried to build. But I also felt relieved that my son could finally breathe without someone monitoring his every thought and activity. Jason called me one Saturday morning while my son was at his mom's place and asked how I was holding up with the single parenting situation. I told him honestly that some days were great and some days were exhausting, that figuring out cooking and cleaning and homework help while working full-time was harder than I'd expected. He laughed and said welcome to what Michaela had been doing for years, then invited us over for dinner the following week. When we showed up at their house on Tuesday evening, their son Lowell answered the door and immediately started talking to my son about an upcoming swim meet, the two of them heading to Lowell's room while the adults stayed in the kitchen. Michaela pulled me aside while Jason grilled chicken outside and asked how my son was doing emotionally, whether the therapy with Marco was helping, and if I'd noticed any setbacks. I told her about the improvement in his grades and his mood, how he smiled more now and talked about future plans instead of just existing day to day. She nodded and said she could see the difference just from watching him interact with Lowell, that he seemed more confident and less afraid of saying the wrong thing. Over dinner, the four of us talked about normal family stuff, school projects and swim times and a movie Lowell wanted to see, and I realized my son was experiencing what healthy family dynamics looked like for maybe the first time. After we left, my son said quietly in the car that he liked going to their house because nobody was watching him to make sure he didn't think bad thoughts. That one sentence made me grateful all over again for Jason and Michaela's steady presence in our lives, this support system that had become crucial for both of us. Marguerite caught me after practice one Thursday evening and asked if I had a minute to talk about my son's progress. We stood by the pool while the other kids dried off and gathered their bags, and she told me his times had improved enough that he'd qualified for a regional competition happening in 6 weeks. She explained that college scouts sometimes attended these bigger meets looking for promising young swimmers, that it was early to think about scholarships but good for him to get comfortable competing at higher levels. My son was excited when I told him in the car, but also nervous, asking what if he messed up in front of all those people and disappointed everyone. I reminded him that swimming was supposed to be fun, that the whole point of fighting for him to stay on the team was so he could enjoy this thing he loved without pressure. We scheduled extra sessions with Marco over the next few weeks to work on the performance anxiety, and Marco gave my son some tools for managing the nerves and keeping the competition in perspective. The day of the regional meet arrived, and I drove us 2 hours to the facility. My son quiet in the passenger seat, going over his race strategy in his head. When his event was called and he walked to the starting blocks, I could see the focus on his face and the confidence in his movements. He dove in at the signal and moved through the water with this freedom and power that made my chest tight, and when he touched the wall in third place, his grin was so genuine and proud that I knew every difficult choice had been worth it. After the medal ceremony, he found me in the stands and said he couldn't believe he'd actually done it, that for the first time he felt like maybe he really could swim in high school and beyond. 3 months had passed since the custody arrangement was finalized, and my son and I sat at our small kitchen table eating pasta and talking about his plans for high school next year. He wanted to try out for the varsity swim team as a freshman, and maybe take some advanced science classes because he'd gotten interested in biology lately. I listened to him map out these ideas for his future with actual excitement in his voice, this kid who 6 months ago had believed his dreams were over before they started. He paused between bites and asked if I was happy with how everything turned out, and I had to think about my answer for a minute. I told him the truth, that I was sad about the divorce and wished his mom could have found a way to support him without all the fear and control. But I also said I was genuinely happy watching him thrive now, seeing him make friends and pursue swimming and plan for a future he actually believed in. He grinned at me across the table and said he was happy too, that life felt possible again in a way it hadn't for years. We were both still figuring things out and healing from everything that had happened, but we were doing it together as a team. That felt like enough for now, this small family of 2 learning how to build something healthy from the broken pieces of what came before.